Alex, Betty, and Chris are trading marbles. First, Alex gives Betty half of his marbles. Then Betty gives Chris 1/3 of her marbles. Finally, Chris gives Alex 2 marbles. If everyone ends up having 12 marbles, how many marbles did each person start with? So let's summarize what's going on. We have 3 people, Alex, Betty, and Chris. First, Alex gives Betty half of his marbles. Then, Betty gives Chris 1/3 of her marbles. And then Chris gives Alex exactly 2 marbles. And after all these exchanges, each child ended up having 12 marbles. 12 marbles. So that's a summary of the problem. And we need to find out how many marbles the 3 children had initially. Each of the 3 children had initially. So let's see how we can solve this problem. We're going to do this problem visually. I'm going to assume Alex had this many marbles. So the blue square represents the total number of marbles Alex originally had. What happens? Alex gives half of his marbles to Betty and he receives 2 marbles from Chris. So this represents half of his marbles. He gives half to Betty. He is left with half. Plus he receives 2 from Chris. So this whole thing has to be 12. And you really want to get that. I'm going to erase that. I'm going to repeat it once again. Alex gives Betty half of his marbles, so he's left with this. Plus he receives 2 from Chris. So this is what he ended up having, and according to the question, he ended up having 12. So what should this blue strip be worth? This blue strip must represent 10 marbles. Then you have 10 plus 2, 12. If half of this blue strip is 10, the whole thing is 20. So Alex originally had 20 marbles. And if he had 20 marbles, he gave half to Betty. Betty must have received 10 marbles from Alex. So let's summarize what we just concluded. Alex originally had 20 marbles and he gave Betty 10 marbles. And we have to kind of keep that straight. So let's move on. Okay. Now, let's say this purple square represents all the marbles Betty had after she received 10 marbles from Alex. And you really have to keep it straight. We're not saying this is the total number of marbles Betty had originally. We are saying this is the total number of marbles Betty had after she received 10 marbles from Alex. So what does Betty do? She gives away 1/3 of her marbles. So let's see what that looks like. Well, she gave away 1/3 of her marbles. And according to the question, at that point, she was left with 12. So this has to be 12. If this whole strip is 12, half of it has to be 6, so this has to be 6. Let's erase it once again. So what we're concluding, this has to be 12. So what she gave to Chris has to be 6. Because when you give away 1/3, you're left with 2/3. If 2/3 is 12, 1/3 has to be 6. This also tells me one more thing. Of course, we know that Betty gave Chris 6 marbles. We have to keep that straight, and we have to remember that. We also know that after Betty received her 10 marbles, she ended up having altogether 18 marbles. This must be 18 now. Now take a look at it. If Betty had 18 marbles after she received 10 of Alex's marbles, how many marbles did she have before Alex gave her 10 of his marbles? I'm going to go ahead and say 8. So originally, Betty must have had 8 marbles. And she gave 6 to Chris. Again, a couple of facts that we gathered. We are going to summarize it right here. So, originally Betty had 8 marbles and she gave 6 to Chris. So let's find out how many marbles Chris had. and we can move forward. Suppose this circle represents all the marbles, not just one marble, all the marbles Chris had originally. Now what happened to Chris? Chris gave 2 marbles to Alex, and he received 6 marbles from Betty. This is simple actually. Let's erase this. So this is what's going on with Chris. Uh, Chris, this was his original number of original marbles right here, the green circle. Original. He got 6 from Betty. He gave 2 to Alex. Well, this has to be 12 according to the question. Because after these two things took place, after he received 6 marbles from Betty and gave 2 away to Alex, he ended up having 12. Well, this is, what should this be? What number plus 6 minus 2 is 12? Well, 6 minus 2 is 4. This is really same as, well, let's erase this and do it one more way. Instead of this, I can scratch it off and write 4. Okay, so green circle plus 4 is 12. Can you tell me what green circle is worth? 8. So the answer is Chris originally had 8 marbles. So let's summarize our findings. Chris originally had 8 marbles, and let's go ahead and list everything that we have found out so far. Alex had 20 marbles to begin with. Betty had 8 marbles to begin with. Chris had 8 marbles to begin with. Now let's go back and check if our answer really makes sense. Well, Alex had 20. Betty had 8. B stands for Betty, A for Alex, C for Chris. 20, 8, and 8 originally. What happened first? Alex gave Betty half of his marbles. So Alex had 10 because half of 20 is 10. Betty got 10, so Betty now has 18. Chris, not much happened with him yet. Okay. Betty gave Chris 1/3 of her marbles. So Alex, not much is going on, so I'm going to write 10 here. If Betty gives Chris 1/3 of her marbles, 1/3 of 18 is 6. So she's giving Chris 6 marbles. She ends up having 12. And Chris got 6 marbles from Betty, so he must have 14 marbles. And finally, Chris gives Alex 2 marbles. So Alex now has 12. Nothing happened to Betty at this point. Chris ended up having 12. So the answer has to be correct. It works. That's my answer. Alex had 20, Betty had 8, Chris had 8.